now so that we've got it all. At the moment, I've got all of your microphones open. If you want to mute yourselves your end, if you expect to have some interruptions or so on, then that's absolutely fine. But while they're working okay, I'll leave them open my end so that you can interrupt with questions. If you find that distracting at any point, then I can always put you all on mute, and you can raise your hands and I can unmute you as you go. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So at the moment, hopefully you can all hear each other and you can all hear me. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
The chat's not working though,
Sorry?
Rachel. The chat. You know, you emailed me in the chat.
Yeah.
It's not working.
I'm going to ignore the
I'm
chat.
trying to
Just use the questions.
Okay. Okay.
So, can you see the questions?
Yeah. Just when we respond, you're not getting our answers.
I haven't got any questions.
I haven't
I
either.
haven't got any questions.
Right. Well, I've unticked the box. You know, I've ticked the box so it says show all questions. So hopefully, as questions come through, if you want to type them, otherwise say them, and then at least we can have the discussion. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Lovely. So we've got until 1 o'clock. So you know, we'll use the time and see how we go. I've put together a presentation. It's very much a guide to what we're going to talk about. Just to set the scene, I mean, most of you, well, some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm a lecturer here, and I have been a lecturer here for not that long. I haven't been here for that long. But last year I was part of the curriculum development team, and so what I wanted to do was, as we're talking, is to share some of the examples and sort of share some of the discussions that we were having when we were trying to rewrite the curriculum for the nursing programme. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
So to try and make it sort of real life examples and some of the challenges that we might have as developing a nice curriculum. So is there anything else that you would like to talk about in terms of curriculum design today?
I've never done it, so.
No, me neither.
So whatever you tell me is going to be good.
Anything? Oh God! Right. So I put a discussion document that was sort of part of the initial discussions when we started the nurse curriculum development on the DLE, which is a Word document. And I've also put an article which I found really interesting that was published in Nurse Education Today in 2013, which was talked about the sort of the philosophical place of nurse academics, which read at your leisure. It's quite an interesting one, but it does bring together some of the educational and learning theories that you've been talking about with Nadine and others. So to start with, curriculum design. So in terms of us, where did we start? It was a very interesting first meeting. It was a very conflicting is the right word, first meeting when we started the nurse curriculum development. Any of you think of some of the really big problems that we have when developing a nurse curriculum?
Issues regarding keeping the content focused.
Okay, so firstly, we've got an enormous amount of content to deliver, and we've got to keep it focused. So that might be one of our difficulties, and it certainly was.
I'm thinking about the balance between practice and theory and trying to not pull students out of practice when they're in practice.
Right, so we have a whole set of issues, Jenny, around practice, in the fact that we want to put them in practice because we want them to learn, but equally we've got, as already stated, an awful lot of content to deliver. So we've got this conflict between theory and practice. So those are two huge issues that we've got. Anything else that you thought?
How about making it all accountable to what the NMC require?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about curriculum development, if you're developing a maths curriculum or you're developing a geography curriculum, whether it be in secondary education or primary education, you don't have the level of regulation that we do in nursing. We've got the NMC, and the NMC are standing over us saying, this is what we want you to do, this is what we want you to deliver. And so we've got a bit of a conflict. We also have this philosophical problem around adult education versus training. I don't know if you've thought about this or you've had this discussion before.
No?
No.
Well,
Yeah, certainly a bit.
because one of the big discussions and sort of not battles, because it wasn't, we didn't come to blows or anything, but one of the really big differences between nurse education sort of historically and now and what we were talking about last year was, overarchingly, we've got a training regime which is competency based, haven't we? That's what the NMC want us to do, which is a training which is competency based, and we've pulled it into HEIs, and we talk about a nurse education. So right from the outset, from the moment you start putting pen to paper, you've got a conflict between a competency based training and a nurse education, and philosophically, how are we going to deliver both at the same time? We also talk about the fact that we're doing a 2-for-1. We're talking about doing a degree and we're talking about doing a nurse training. So in 3 years, we've got to cram in, and somebody already mentioned about the massive amount of content, we've got to cram in everything practically we want them to know and everything theoretically we want them to know. And we also want them to be able to link the two together. So we've started off with a really, really complicated mess, haven't we? Or we did.
Yeah. Sounds horrendous.
Pardon?
It sounds awful. Where do you start?
Well, we sort of sat there for a bit and scratched our heads, to be honest. But there were a lot of things that we knew we had to do. So in terms of our nurse curriculum last year and the curriculums I've been involved with in the past, you've got a blank piece of paper and you've got certain givens. So we start off with the sort of the basic principles, and I've just keyed out some of the basic principles that we started with. We had to ensure that we had a programme that was planned and reviewed and done in a timely fashion. We were also set in a structure that the university sets for us, which is this modular structure that we have to sit within. So we had this future programme that had to be planned, and we knew it had to have a modular structure. So those were two things that were sort of being imposed on us. And the first thing we had to do was sort of to clarify the purpose and the pedagogies underpinning the programme. So in terms of the purpose, we already knew the purpose of it. That's the NMC determines for us, and we've got the output of our programme has got to be qualified practitioners. But then we had that discussion about what was our pedagogical theory, what was our philosophical strategy going to be. And then we had to facilitate the development of these curriculum planning skills. And the thing is that most of us in the room had never written a curriculum from scratch. We'd been part of the development of other curriculums, but we'd never written one from scratch. So we were really trying to learn as we went. And in terms of the curriculum development group, we did really want engagement with all the other academics, not just on our programme, but on all other programmes, so that we could get some sort of academic debate happening. And then we had to look at how we were going to take these philosophical ideas and all of these different academic opinions and put them into a operationalised curriculum. So from a practical perspective, have any of you been involved some of you who work in the university may, and some of you may not, been involved in an approval event yet?
No.
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 Okay.
I attended the supervisor of midwives approval event with the NMC when I first arrived.
Right. And there was a lot of documentation, I expect, presented.
Enormous and very, very formal.
Yes. Yeah, and it doesn't sort of, you don't read it and go, oh, I know exactly what this is going to look like. That's one of the biggest issues. We write these approval documents, and then alongside that goes our operational specifications, and then our program specifications, and then our module records. And those 4 pieces of information sit together in this university and form the curriculum. But then you've got to take that documentation and operationalize it into an actual timetable. So at this point, we are miles away from creating a timetable. We haven't even put pen to paper in terms of a timetable yet. But there is a temptation sometimes, and certainly in the room, there was a temptation for academics to go, right, this is what I want in the timetable. And I don't know whether when you thought about what we were going to talk about today in terms of curriculum design, whether you thought we were going to talk about timetables.
I don't know about timetables specifically, but certainly from a clinical point of view, I was wondering how you have the right staff in the right areas to deliver the curriculum.
Sorry, say that again. Sorry, we had a bit of feedback there.
The way I was looking at it, because I'm very much in practice rather than education, is whether you have the right staff to deliver the program, the curriculum. That's the problem I was thinking of straight away. It's like, how many staff have you got to support these students and to deliver the program you want to deliver?
Yeah, I'm not sure that question's ever actually asked, but we'll come to that in a little bit when we look at resources and how we put together a curriculum. But yeah, that's a question that at this point we weren't even having that conversation. We also weren't having a conversation about how many students we're actually talking about, because as some of you may be aware, our student numbers are annually reviewed, and we really have no idea of how many students we're going to be talking about year on year. We have a vague idea, but until we get our commissioned numbers, we have never known. And we've got a different problem coming up because we won't have commissioned numbers as of next year. We'll be looking at how many students we recruit at £9,000 a year. So we're going to have a different set of questions to ask ourselves in terms of our curriculum. But before we even come to who's going to teach what in where and when, and how that timetable's got to look, we've got to think about what is our underlying philosophy, and what sort of philosophical ontology, and you're all familiar with these words now, are we going to come from? And that's before we've even decided what content's going where and what modules are going where. Now, I know you've all spent some time looking at learning theories. So I just wanted to have a little think about some learning theories that you've discussed. And that's a bit of a messy diagram, isn't it? But it was taken from one of the sessions you've already had with Nadine. So all of you are familiar, or some of you are familiar with some of them, and most of you are familiar with bits of them, about all of these different psychoeducational origins. All of these learning theories. So picking just some of them, we've got peer review, we've got peer assisted, we've got problem-based learning, we've got experiential learning, we've got constructionism, we've got cognitive conflict, we've got social independence, all of these different learning theories. And so when we're designing a curriculum, we have to, at some point, make some overarching statement about where our curriculum is going to come from. So if you look at that messy map in front of you, what does anything sort of jump out at you and you think, right, well, that's a learning theory we need to employ in terms of a nursing curriculum?
Active learning.
Active learning, yeah. So in terms of their practice, when they're out physically learning, they've got to be active, they've got to participate in it. Is there anything else that jumps out at you?
I'm thinking about peer-assisted learning that's happening in the PALS, within the PALS initiative.
Yeah. So that's where we're going to use not us as academics, but we're going to use their peers to assist, support, and develop their learning. So it's something that we definitely employ in our curriculum.
Experiential learning as well, and in terms of clinical skills, for example, and reflective learning, which they do in their practice.
Yep. Okay. So we're going to use some of Lewin and some of Dewey, and we're going to look at a little bit of experiential learning, and we're going to we're going to use those as some of the key resources of what they're going to learn when they're either in practice or in university.
And problem-based learning is a major one in the nursing and medical curriculums.
Yes, it's Muriel, isn't it? Recognise your voice.
Yeah.
But yeah, problem-based learning. I mean, problem-based learning is sort of ebbing and flowing a little bit. If you go back sort of 1995, 1998, there were certain curriculums, certainly in medicine, that were employing a complete problem-based learning approach, using Barrow's tutorial method of posing a problem to a group of students and asking them to actively manage that problem. And we employ it to a greater or lesser extent in some of our modules. So problem-based learning is certainly a learning theory that we utilise a lot in health education, not just nursing.
And also constructivism, I suppose, throughout the programme in terms of them starting off as knowing very little and then building up their knowledge throughout the programme?
Yeah, so we do use principles of constructivism. It's social constructivism, I would argue, when we talk about it in nursing, because it's about building a collaborative learning approach. So you've got a bit of collaborative learning as well. So if I was trying to put together an overarching philosophical statement about what learning theories I was going to employ in our nursing curriculum, it would be a bit of a mishmash, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's going to be all of these. The problem is that when you put an approval document together, you can't go, I'm going to give you a little diagram and I'm going to use a bit of all of them. You've got to give an overarching statement about where your philosophy comes from, and that's really difficult. And we spent, when I say hours, I mean hours, discussing what was our vision, our view on our pedagogy going to be in terms of our nursing curriculum. And some people were very happy with the answer and some people weren't, because you're never going to get a complete agreement. But our overarching philosophy was that of constructivism, really. But we looked at it in terms of social reconstructivism, and I put a paper on the DLE that talks about what social reconstructionism is and what it actually means. So we'll talk about that.
Rachel, can I ask something?
Yeah.
It's Jenny. I'm just thinking about, so you had loads of sort of discussions around this for the new curriculum. What happened in the old curriculum, or is this kind of a new requirement that you have to have an overarching philosophy? I mean, wasn't there already an approach that was used?
No, it's something that would have been discussed with the in the old curriculum, and the old curriculum states quite well. No, I'm not going to say it states quite clearly, but it states that it's using an instrumentalism principles, but its overarching philosophy is that of constructivism, and that's of the curriculum that we're presently using. So there always is a discussion of the philosophical background of the curriculum. This time, okay. I'm talking about it this time specifically because I was involved in the discussion. But if you read the curriculum that we're presently using, which was validated in 2011, 2012. Well, it started in September 2012, so it was validated in 2011. It talks about constructivism, social constructivism, and instrumentalism as being its overarching philosophical principles. So very similar in a way, but one of the things that we felt when we were developing the curriculum last year was that it wasn't clear. And I think by the fact that you've even asked the question, Jenny, it isn't clear, is it?
No, it's not clear to us, from lecturers' point of view. It's not really clear what kind of overarching philosophy we're using.
No.
Although I suppose we all kind of assume that we all know that there is kind of building on knowledge from year 1 to year 3, and that happens through a social process, I suppose.
Yeah. So we make an assumption, and we make an assumption based on our own personal belief that constructivism is something that's happening. But if we wanted to give a really clear philosophical statement, I don't think it's clear in every module handbook, in every program handbook, it's not explicit, is it?
No.
It's a sort of implied knowledge. We have an assumption that everybody's going to have that overarching philosophy. But I don't think everybody does. That's the problem we face. So that might be my overarching philosophy, Jenny, and it might be yours. But if you asked every single lecturer, is it theirs? I'm not going to give you, there's no answer to that question. You can't ask everybody to have the same philosophical background, but what you're asking people to do is to interpret the curriculum in the same way. And again, that has problems, doesn't it?
I should imagine it has particular problems because we have so many lecturers involved in our faculty. So there's going to be a broad range of views and experiences.
Absolutely. But the aim of any kind of curriculum, is that we're all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. That we all, although it might not sit with our own personal philosophy, we all do have a knowledge and an acceptance that that's the curriculum that we're working towards. So when designing a curriculum, you want everybody on the faculty to buy in to the principles that you're talking about. And that's the hope. If you've written a curriculum well, it should be obvious and it should be something that everybody can engage with. And that's not a criticism of the curriculum that we're working with at the moment, but I think what we've found with this curriculum that we're using at the moment is that we've had an awful lot of curriculum drift. Have you heard that expression before?
No.
No, I haven't.
Sorry?
No, I haven't heard that drift.
What we refer to in curriculum drift is that the approval document and the original recipe, as it were, we've actually drifted a little bit too far away from it. Because what we've done is we've given this module to that person and this module to the other person. And because we're left with a modular system, that those modules have been developed in isolation and there hasn't been any overarching person saying, well, you're moving too far away from the philosophical background of the curriculum. And so
it's a very difficult balance to get, though, because if you made that so specific, then it's inevitable you're not going to get everybody agreeing on it. And with that many people involved in a curriculum, surely you have to be vague to an extent to allow them to develop something.
Yes, you've got to give people the autonomy and the freedom to manage their modules in a way that suits them best. But if you have written a curriculum well, hopefully there is a degree of collaboration and agreement that that's the overarching principles.
Right.
There isn't a golden bullet though. There isn't a perfect way to do this. There are lots
That
of...
must be incredibly hard with the amount of people involved. I just know in practice trying to get agreement by a group of 6 people can be impossible. So let alone however many is involved in the whole curriculum for this programme.
Yeah, well, it was decided, rightly or wrongly, that it would be done through sort of a democratic method, in the fact that teams were put together and those teams took the lead in certain different themes, and then there was a core team that would keep pulling everybody back to the original message. And that one thing we did agree with this new curriculum was that even once the curriculum was operationalised, that core team would stay together and monitor the development of each of the separate modules, so that you would overcome some of the issues of curriculum drift, so that you would keep people revisiting their, when they do general module development, that you would say, but remember your original learning outcomes, remember your original philosophy, what was the aims and objectives of that particular module and how it sat within the programme. And so you kept everybody on the same page. One thing that's happened, sort of slightly unfortunately, with the curriculum that we're using at the moment is that nobody's done that. And so there is an assumption that, oh yeah, we know that that's being covered in that module, or we know that that's being covered in that module, or for example, there was an assumption, and this is a really small example, but there was an assumption that in year 2 they were being taught the liver, so that when we revisited an issue surrounding the management of a patient with a liver disorder in the year 3, that they would have that basic knowledge. But the people who were developing the year 2 module had dropped it because they didn't feel it was important. So when we then got them in year 3, they hadn't had the basic knowledge. And so the problem with a curriculum, when you've got that amount of content to deliver, there has to be somebody keeping it on track. It's not.
That's a really interesting thought, in particular with the biology, and I take your point with the sort of concept of the liver, and the biology module is one of the ones I'm particularly interested in. And it's badged, it's a year 2 module, and it's badged as biological and therapeutic aspects of nursing care. However, the amount of therapies that we have the time to cover is extremely limited. So I wonder whether some of the problem of curriculum design is working out what to leave out.
Yes. And just the inclusion and exclusion criteria for what makes the cut and what doesn't is really difficult. It's really difficult. It's a really challenging mechanism. Now, if you look at problem-based learning curriculum, they make the assumption that that it's only 30% of learning happens in the module. The other 70% of learning happens because of associated reading.
If that's performed as well, because something that's come to light with regard to skills, teaching nasogastric skills to year 2s last week, none of them, not even the good students, had read the pre-work, so it meant that we had to spend quite a lot of time going over something they should already know.
Yeah, so that looks at issues of student engagement. So why aren't they engaging with the material? Certain colleagues of ours say that, constantly say to the students, you have to read for a degree. So why have you come to class unprepared? But that builds on those philosophical theories of, this active, engaged, socially independent learner. So let's just...
When I asked the students about it, they actually said that there was a problem with the content, with the content that was being delivered. It didn't quite meet. There were diagrams and worksheets, but they hadn't, and the way the diagrams printed meant that they couldn't associate it with the right part of the diagram, or they weren't quite sure how to complete it. But that student, so it is about engaging with the students to get enough feedback to find out where things are going wrong as well. So it's even more complicated than just getting the lecturers to agree, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, if you look at some of the learning theories that we're going to talk about in a minute, student engagement and student participation in their learning has got to be primary to any curriculum we design. We can't design a curriculum without the students engaging with it. If they don't engage with it, we'll never, ever deliver it successfully. So one of the things that when we were putting together the groups last year for the new curriculum was that we had students. We had to have users engaged in the process. So I'm just going to have a look at some of the theories that you've already talked about. So we've talked about some of these a little bit already. We talked about behavioural, humanistic, cognitive constructivism and experiential learning. And I know that you've talked about these in terms of learning theories, but I just wanted to put them in the context of a curriculum very briefly for you. So in terms of a behavioural curriculum, and this is what you've just been talking about really, Muriel, it's about, behavioural curriculum. It aims that the learning is going to change behaviour. Now, we've also got to engage them in it. So we talk about the teachers controlling the process by selecting stimuli and reinforcing them with approved responses. So we might say that sounds a little bit like Pavlov's dogs there, doesn't it? But isn't a behavioural curriculum, isn't that what we're engaging with when we talk about skills? We set them up with a specific skill and we reinforce them. We ask them to repeat it so that they perform it in a specific way. Now, they in this particular discussion, which you had with Nadine, is about reinforcement and responses and reward and punishment. So for us, in terms of skills, we talk about passing and failing their OSCEs and their ISCEs, but we ask them to change their behaviour. So we might be using a little bit of behavioural theory when we teach skills. Can you think of any other examples that we might use sort of a behavioural theory?
Well, what about role modelling? Just in general, I feel sometimes as an educator, you're kind of a role model as well as a teacher, and that's kind of about students mimicking your behaviours, your language, the language they use, for example. Yeah.
So when they're out in practice, they are learning certain behaviours, and we've got to hope, and we rely on practice, that the behaviours that they're learning out there are the correct, for want of a better expression, behaviours, that they are having positive role models to follow. Mm. The problem we face is when they've learned a particular behaviour in a particular environment, they move that behaviour into a different environment and it doesn't work. Because that behaviour doesn't work in every single environment. So we're expecting our students to be very, very adaptable, aren't we?
Yes, but certain behaviours such as professionalism, for example, they can learn, and that would be applicable to all environments.
Yeah. So certain communication techniques, as you said, professionalism, but there's a sort of attitudes and behaviours that you might have in a specific clinical environment that don't necessarily transfer well to a different clinical environment. So we do expect them to be quite insightful in terms of their behaviour. So a behavioural curriculum might engage some aspects of practice. And we talk about a humanistic curriculum. This is where we're active engagement of the learner with the world and themselves. So this is where we are going to, our role as a teacher is to increase the range of experiences available. So this is where we're sending them out into practice, and we're asking them to experience the world and everything that it's got in it in terms of healthcare. That's quite a difficult task.
So Rachel, so it's Rebecca speaking.
Sorry?
I've got a question, Rachel. It's
Hello,
Rebecca.
yeah.
So when you're looking at a behaviourist curriculum,
Yeah.
That's something that translates better to clinical practice. Yeah.
Yeah, you could apply it to
Would you
clinical
say?
practice and you could apply it to clinical skills, because when we talk about
Yes.
behavioural curriculum, behavioural principles, we're asking them to adopt a particular behaviour.
Okay. Because I'm thinking about it in context with the learning package that I'm adapting.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about my impact on them as learners in the clinical placement. I'm teaching them in university.
Yeah.
Their mentors, when they go out into practice, might have a slightly different learning technique. It's just something to think about, isn't it? If you're trying to teach them a clinical skill, but obviously everyone's got a slant on that clinical skill and how they do it and how they don't do it. So there is always a bit of a
Conflict.
not a controversy, but there's always like a bit of a crossover, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, and we talk about cognitive conflict, don't we?
Cognitive conflict. Yeah, that's a good word. I'll write that down.
But that's also about perception. So what you believe is right and what I believe is right. The basic skill and the aim of the exercise is the same.
Yeah.
We might go about it in a completely different way. And that's hopefully, if we look at all of these different learning theories, so in terms of behaviouralist and humanistic and constructivist, if we use them all in isolation, then we're going to have real problems with our students. And we've got to pick bits of the theories that apply to what we're teaching them and how we want them to behave, because it is quite complicated. But we do have a degree of cognitive conflict all the time. And we constantly hear this in university when the student says to us, yeah, I was taught how to do it in skills, but when I went out into practice, that's not how they did it.
Yeah, well, this is the trouble. Even though it's a competency-based program, and there is sort of core competencies, everyone will hold their suturing equipment differently, for instance.
Yeah.
So the students then get shown how to do it in university, and then they go out into practice, and someone else will show, well, I don't do it like that. I do it like this because I find this easier. So they sort of start picking up little tips, some good, some not so good, along the way. But it doesn't make what they're doing bad. It just changes. It metamorphosises, I suppose.
Yeah, but it also talks about how the student can adapt and change their behaviour slightly to fit the environment they're in.
Yeah.
Using some transferable information, because the basic principles are always the same, and that's what we try and teach them in skills, for example, that the principles have got to be the same. Yes, the environment and the mechanism may change, the package may change, the dressing pack, for example, if we're thinking about dressings, may change slightly from trust to trust, from district nursing practice to district nursing practice, but the principles are the same. And sometimes the students find that kind of cognitive conflict very difficult to manage.
Yeah.
Because they want one way, and they want the right way, and they want a yes/no answer.
Yeah.
And we can't give them that. So it does sort of lean itself a little bit more to sort of the humanistic approach, where we've got a range of experiences, where we've got to engage the learner, expose them to everything, and then they can pick the bits that they need for that particular setup. And then we look at a cognitive curriculum. Cognitive is meant to be about mental behaviour, isn't it? So when we talk about a cognitive curriculum, we're talking about learning certain mental exercises, things of critical thinking, intelligence, knowledge, and we test that in a very structured way. So we might set them an exam, a multiple choice exam, but it's about them recounting specific information if we're looking at a cognitive curriculum. Now, there are aspects of a cognitive curriculum in our nursing curriculum, but it's not really explicit. An example of a very cognitive curriculum might be a maths curriculum. So if you were designing a curriculum for GCSE maths, it would be based very much along the cognitive lines, because you are asking them to information process. but we're not designing that sort of curriculum. So although there is some knowledge and skills that they have to have by the end of the process, it's very subtle, and it's not very explicit. So that might be something that doesn't appear very strongly. But I think in nursing curriculums, this is where constructivists or reconstructivists or social constructivists, and these are adaptations of the same term, will come into play. And this is the kind of curriculum that we're definitely using when we're developing a nursing curriculum. And every curriculum I've been involved with, both here at Plymouth and at other universities, has been overarchingly based on the constructivist principle, which is where learning is an active process, that it's subjective representations of objective reality. And that's a really complex idea to get your head around. So that third one down, when you talk about subjective representation of objective reality, do you understand what I mean by that?
Well, yes, because what is an objective reality anyways? We all got our subjective and ideas, and we kind of construct our own reality, don't we?
Yeah. So when we talk about, going back to that earlier question about cognitive conflict and that theoretical knowledge and transferring it into reality, the thing that we have got to get over to our students right at the beginning of their programme is that it's about key principles. Your reality and my reality are something completely different. And every environment that you go into will be slightly different, but specific key principles will be key to your practice. And I think it was Jenny mentioned earlier about professionalism. And one of those things that I think is transferable across all areas is professionalism. But it means something quite different to different people, doesn't it? But we all have a consensus about what it should mean to everybody. What is it that makes a person professional? What is it that makes them, what is it that makes a student demonstrate professionalism? Anybody? We mark them on it, we tick them on it, we put it in their oar, we constantly assess them on it. So what is it?
It's so many things, though. I think you're right. The students don't realise small things like time management, for example.
Yep.
They don't realise how much that says about their ability to be professional.
So I think it was Muriel earlier said about the not coming to class prepared. I would argue that that's unprofessional.
I agree, yeah.
That if they don't appear in the right place at the right time, in the right kit, with the right knowledge in their head, that they are being unprofessional. And whether that's in practice or in skills or in the lecture theatre or in a seminar or in a tutorial, it doesn't matter. So maybe we should spend the first couple of...
I agree.
Sorry.
That's okay. I agree. I think it is something that could be perceived as unprofessional, but that's quite a challenging thing to say to the students, isn't it? And maybe that just takes a bit more courage. Talking from a personal perspective, if I was to use the words unprofessional, I think that they would be horrified, but perhaps that's something that I need to start considering.
But as it says there, mental representations are subjective. So, you know, if I said to one group of students they're being unprofessional, they might shrug and go, yeah, okay. Other groups of students might be heartbroken and burst into tears. You know, you're going to have a different response to that expression. But it's about setting the agenda right from the beginning. So if we set them up with this idea that this is their learning and this is their construction and they've got to manage it and they've got to be the information constructor in the process, that maybe we would have a more engaged, more professional, for want of a better expression, student population. I'll leave that question for somebody else to answer, but because we're going to move on. So I think we can all agree that any curriculum we develop in terms of nursing is going to be based on the learning theory of constructivism, a constructivist approach. This was a picture that we had up on the board right at the beginning, and it's something that I was given when I did my MA Learning and Teaching, so it's really old. Not that. The problem is that it was a design that we put together, so this isn't. This is sort of it's available broadly on the internet. It's not something that has an explicit reference. But we talked about squaring the circle. So this bit right in the middle, if you focus on it, is about this student achievement. So what are we trying to achieve? So in terms of our nursing curriculum, what do we want? It's that bit in the middle. What is it that we want? We want this sort of evidence-based decision maker. We want a registered nurse, and we want a knowledgeable doer. Well, the knowledgeable doer comes from the NMC, doesn't it? That's what they've asked for. So that's what we've got to give them. We've got to give them somebody who is knowledgeable but can do the job. So if we look at that squaring the circle principle, we've got the standards that we are going to have to incorporate in our curriculum design. So when we're designing it in university, we've got two branches of our standards coming together. We've got our university standards, so what it means to get a degree, and what the university sets us as standards for learning. And then for us in nursing, we've got the NMC. Nursing and midwifery, sorry Rebecca, I keep saying nursing.
Yeah, it's all right, I'm used to it.
I do mean nursing and midwifery. But the NMC are very, very specific. We don't have an awful lot of flexibility. I don't know if you're all aware that the curriculum that we were writing last year is now on hold. Do you all know that?
No.
Yes.
Okay. Basically, the NMC has said they don't want us to write any new curriculums at the moment because they're going to rewrite their whole competency framework to reflect the Shape of Caring document that came out last year. So we were writing a curriculum to the existing NMC standards, and then we were given, and we at Plymouth aren't unusual. All universities have been given an extension. And so we have to write the curriculum when the new standards come out.
Have you heard, Rachel, when that's going to be?
They keep moving the goalposts on that one, Jenny. It was going to be shortly after Christmas. So shortly after Christmas to me means by the end of January, because as far as I'm concerned, that's shortly after Christmas. But we haven't got anything yet. I think we will go through the end of this financial year, so we'll get to April. They might come out in May, but we don't have a definitive date. But we've been given.
How did? Sorry, Rachel, it was Diane. How does this all fit with? We were talking to Adele Kane not long ago about this apprenticeship thing that they were bringing in for nursing.
Yeah.
So if they haven't made up their minds yet on whether even that's going to happen, how are they now bringing out new competency, new standards? Well,
if you're aware of Shape of Caring, which is the document I'm referring to, it talks about competencies across the board, from healthcare assistants throughout the whole remit of nursing. Sort of it's talking about a care certificate for unregistered nurses, and then talking about registered nurses as well.
Okay.
So it's going to have enormous implications to what we train and how we train and how we educate.
Wow.
and quite amusing. I don't know if amusing is the right word, but it's talking about having a shortened 2-year practical program, which doesn't result in a registered nursing qualification, but results in some sort of lesser certificate. What does that sound like?
Is this sound like we just had a survey done on the associate practitioners that they're bringing in? Is this linked to the same thing?
Yeah. So an associate practitioner sounds very much like an SEN to me.
Yeah, what they're denying.
I know they're denying it, but that's my personal opinion. I've no written evidence for that, but I just look at those documents and I think, we're looking at a healthcare assistant who is meant to be a trained, unregistered practitioner, and an SEN type associate, and then a registered nurse. And it just looks very similar to the system that when I started my training, that what we were using.
Yeah, I've literally just filled in this morning from the RCN about associate practitioners, and I feel very much the same as you. I don't know how they haven't said how they're going to be regulated.
No.
They haven't said how they're going to be implemented in practice, and they're not going to work anyway in very specialist areas where we've already got systems in place to bridge a gap.
Yeah. So there is a discussion or an argument that practitioners such as healthcare assistants should have some degree of monitoring, and whether that should come from the NMC. But if they're registered with the NMC, what are they going to be registered as?
Well, the NMC is just a joke anyway, because the NMC haven't even got to grips with the practitioners, which we've currently got. Even now, as an ANNP with a Masters in Neonates, they haven't even got us registered as a registered qualification.
Right.
So if they're not registered with the practitioners they've already got, how are they on about implementing yet another role with another title with practitioner on it?
Okay, we're going to get back to curriculum design now before we become political.
Yeah.
Maybe when we're together on whatever date it is in March, we can have a discussion about what we think the NMC should and should not be doing in terms of failure to fail and so on, because I believe we're meeting up in March for a face-to-face day, so we can have those conversations then. But getting back to curriculum design, so we've got standards when we're thinking about, we've also got evidence. So when we talk about evidence, we talk about how will the students' learning be demonstrated, assessed and evaluated. And we spend an enormous time talking about this when we talk about any kind of curriculum. So how are we going to demonstrate the student knows what we say they know? And so, I've listed a few things there. We've got exams, we've got MCQs, we've got assessments, we've got practice assessments, OSCEs and ISCEs. There isn't a set formula. But if you look back at the learning theories that we've talked about, the humanistic approach, the behavioural approach, the cognitive approach, and the constructivist approach, those particular examples of evidence sort of sit with all of those different learning theories. So if we're talking about a cognitive approach, then an exam or an MCQ will be very helpful. If we're talking about a behavioural, then an OSCE or an ISCE, a humanistic, then a practice assessment. If we're talking about cognitive and we're talking about constructivism, then an assignment might work. So what other evidence can we bring into a curriculum to establish that the learner has done what we say they've done? Any?
How about displaying it in the OR? I'm just thinking again, I'm linking it back to clinical skills and suturing. Yeah. In their OR, they have to demonstrate that they've had an exposure to practice. But if they had a clinical mentor saying that they had done some suturing or they'd achieved this, that's one way of assessing they've learnt, I guess.
Yeah, so using not necessarily an OSCE or an ISCE, but maybe a practical demonstration.
Yeah.
Sort of in a way, it's that medical model, which is sort of see one, do one, teach one, isn't it?
Yeah, although we don't follow that as such in midwifery, but we do, if you've had the theory day at university and your mentor hopefully will facilitate your practice, helping you in practice, then if they've logged that in the OR that they've seen a student suture, then to me that's a valid assessment.
Right.
Because they should have done it. They would have done it under supervision by a qualified practitioner. So I don't know quite what learning curriculum. I don't know quite what that fits as far as a curriculum, but I think that's a bona fide assessment and evaluation.
Yeah. So in terms of their learning, that would reflect a behavioural model, wouldn't it? That you've shown them how to do something, and then you've established that they can do it using a visual assessment or a demonstration assessment.
Yeah, and that might be, I mean, they do it on the models in university, but they might actually be doing it in practice in real, on real women in practice, and the clinical mentor would then be assessing their progress or assessing their skill, and that would be captured in the OR. Yeah.
So some sort of practice assessment. And we have the ongoing achievement record that we use at Plymouth is meant to build a profile of them being able to undertake practical skills, which is why in our nursing curriculum, in their ongoing achievement record, there has to be a direct observation of everything. There can be another piece of evidence as well, but we have to have had the mentor see them do it. Yeah,
and it's the same thing in midwifery as well, and they would then capture it in their OR, and the clinical mentor would write something about what they did, even if it was just how to tie a suturing knot. It doesn't have to be the full thing. What was I going to say? I've forgotten now. Anyway, I know what I mean. Profile of competence, but I think that is a bona fide assessment.
Yeah, and that would provide a really good piece of evidence that they can do a particular practical skill.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's not on this slide is the portfolio. And I find in our program that that's a bit of a problem, because it seems that students are not really showing their mentors the e-portfolio, because it's a problem with uploading PebblePad in practice. And as a personal tutor, I look through all my students' e-portfolios, but I have been told that I don't have to. So really, the quality of evidence is just so different from student to student, and that's a shame, because that could be used better, I think.
Yeah, it could be used much better. The problem is that we have a sort of conflict there, because we've asked the mentors to make a professional judgment about the evidence that they've supplied. So if we then check it as well in university, what are we going to do if we deem it not to be satisfactory?
I think what we can do, and what I do, is give them guidance. I wouldn't undermine what the mentor has done, what they passed them, or what kind of grade they've given them. But I would say to the student, okay, so in this placement you wrote one reflection and it was 1 page. So for the next practice placement, I expect you to write to reflect more on your practice. So things like that, just sort of guide them.
Yeah, and also we can guide the mentors when we do mentor updates, so that we can educate them from both sides. It's our role to educate the students and say, actually, our expectations are we need a little bit more from you than this. But equally, we can turn to the mentors and say to them, actually, evidence needs to be a little bit more comprehensive than it was. But it's still a personal assessment that needs to be undertaken. Oops, sorry. So that's the kind of evidence. So we've got lots of different pieces of evidence we might use to assess that they've learned what we've asked them to learn. And then we talk about instruction. So what strategies will the teacher, the students use to learn or teach effectively? Now, within the curriculum that we are working with at the moment and the curriculum that we were developing, we looked at the principles of lectures, and lectures being not just your face-to-face lectures, I mean also webinars, so or interactive lectures, seminars, demonstrations, problem-based learning, or inquiry-based learning. So there's lots of different strategies that we can use, and I haven't even touched on practice and other mechanisms by which we can instruct the student. But we have to make a statement that the strategies we're going to employ sit within the philosophy that we've engaged with. So if we've decided we're using a social reconstructivist principle, we have to use instruction techniques that build the student's knowledge effectively. And so if we are going to use that kind of philosophy, we have to assume that they are going to engage. And maybe, going back to a conversation we were having earlier, that assumption isn't correct. If a student has come to class and they haven't read the background material, they haven't done the work that they were meant to have done, so they haven't engaged in the process. So we're not going to be able to teach effectively then. So when we're designing our curriculum, we need to think very carefully about what strategies we're going to use and how they sit within our overarching philosophy. And that's where things like problem-based learning are very linked to a philosophy. So if you were using a problem-based learning curriculum, you would only have problem-based learning tutorials. And that has problems. I mean, I have been involved in the curriculum that used problem-based learning solely as its method of instruction. And although for the engaged, brighter students it was very successful, for the unengaged, weaker students it wasn't. So we've also got to fit a instruction method that fits all types of learners and all abilities of learners. So hopefully by having a mix of different instruction techniques and instruction mechanisms, we can appeal to as many of the students and learners as we can and fit the approaches of as many teachers as we can. Because I'm sure we're all aware that some teachers love giving lectures, some don't, some lecturers love giving seminars, some don't, etc. Equally, some students love big lectures and some prefer small tutorials. So by employing a variety of mechanisms, we can hopefully reach all of our students and appeal to all of our lecturers. And this was something that somebody, I think it was Nicola, mentioned right at the beginning, that when we're designing a curriculum, we need to think about our resources. So what resources are available and required to support the students in their learning? And one of the resources that we're always talking about is our staffing. So have we got enough lecturers to deliver the content that we've said we need to deliver? Have we got the infrastructure? Have we got, and I've put TIS there, which is our technology and information support, and have we got the placements? And when we were faced with a blank piece of paper back at the middle of last year about our new curriculum, those four things became incredibly loud in the room. Because it's all well and good as saying, oh, we'd love to do this, this and this, but can we? And here at Plymouth, one of the biggest problems we have is our infrastructure. So we've recruited a cohort of 500 students and we haven't got a room big enough to put 500 students in.
So can I just say something about that, Rachel?
Yeah.
I've been speaking about this, I think, in another session as well. But I think it's a bit strange that we take in 500 students a year and we have sort of 300 students in September. Well, 300 students in September and 100 students in February. So this is for September students. We have difficulties finding rooms for them. Instead of putting 200 in September and 200 in February.
Yeah, I mean, and your question is, why?
My question is, why is that?
I suppose that there's many questions, but one of them is a university question, in the fact that our systems and processes are set up for a September intake and they aren't set up as well for a February intake. So are we therefore disadvantaging a large group of people? But maybe we should change the systems to fit.
Well, yes, because if that's the case, then that seems ethically not ethically unfair to the 100 students who are getting in February.
Yeah. But can we recruit 200 to February and 200 to September?
Well, if we only recruit 200 in September and tell the other 100 that you can either say, don't become a nurse, or you can join the February group, maybe they would.
We run a risk that they might not, though.
I suppose.
They'll actually go to another university, and one of the problems I suspect is that the access courses and the A-level routes all complete in summer, and students can get away with having a few weeks off and then start. But if they had to manage financially and sort of report to their families what they're up to between July and February, they might have a bit more of an issue.
Mm.
But I agree, it would be nice to have 2 regular intakes of the same thing, but I think the idea of being able to change the university process is possibly a bit ambitious.
I think you might be right. I think we would run into a huge number of problems, but I get your point, Jenny. It's a very, and it was a discussion that we had. Why are we setting ourselves up for difficulty with such a large group in September and then having a smaller group in February? There were all sorts of discussions around that. Other universities have a phased start, so they have people starting in batches. If you go back to hospital-based training, you had cohorts starting at every 3 months throughout the year. But how would we resource that?
Mm.
And so there are problems and complexities to having 2 equal-sized cohorts. For example, you would have to resource them twice, so you would need more staff. So there's a whole chicken and egg situation that goes on. And when you look at the curriculum design, you have to think, how are we going to resource it? How is it going to work within our infrastructure? And then,
with regards, sorry. Well, I was just going to say, with regards to staffing, the weird thing that's happening now is that September cohort is still too big to have all the students in one classroom. So lecturers we're doubling up for September, and then we're doing it again in February. Mm. So I find that either we should take everyone in September, 400 students, we would still be able to, so we would double up, but we wouldn't have to do it in February, or we do the 50-50, and then we just do it once in September and once in February. At the moment, we do it 3 times a year.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the decision that we have to have a February intake is not necessarily ours, and that's something that's come from the commissioners.
Okay.
So that isn't our decision to make. That was.
It may also change with the change over to loans, won't it?
It may do.
That's potential.
It may do. We may lose our February intake altogether, because if we don't commit, we don't have enough numbers, we won't need one. But equally,
and also, would you not have more flexibility if this, hypothetically, if the apprenticeship nurse system comes into place, whereas actually nurses are employed by their trusts and then just seconded to do their training in university, you'd have a heck of a lot more flexibility in how you run your courses.
Yes, we would. But if we look at the Department of Health budget, they're not going to be able to afford it.
Okay. So it is hypothetically.
Yeah, but that goes back to a curriculum that was that goes back to when we had training based in hospital trusts. The reason it's
yes, I had 3 intakes there because I trained in hospital, and there was 3 distinct intakes.
Yeah, but that's when they paid for it, they resourced it, they managed it. They gave nurse education or nurse training over to the universities, and we turned it into a nurse education, not a nurse training.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so there was a philosophical shift in 1995 when we moved all of nurse training into university, and it stopped being a nurse training and started being a nurse education. The NMC never really picked up on that though, did they? Because they still have us doing a nurse training. And that goes back to that philosophical conversation we were having right at the beginning about that conflict between university and the NMC. So anyway, how much time have I got? We're chatting. I've got about 3 minutes before I might lose our session. So I just want to have a quick look. Yeah, that was the last slide. So when we started, and we've talked really much about this, that when we started, we had some key university policy considerations to take into account. And in terms of Plymouth, we had that graduate attitude, and all of you that are university staff will know about our curriculum enrichment projects. But that had to be explicit in our programs, that we had this graduate. We were developing a graduate. We had our university teaching and learning strategy, which talks about internationalism and sustainability. We sort of bracket internationalism when we talk about nursing programs, because of course we can't take international students because of funding issues. That again will change when we're looking at a loan system. There's nothing to stop somebody from abroad coming over and doing their training, whereas commissioned numbers dictated that we had to take UK and EU residents before. And we've got a sustainability agenda. In terms of our faculty teaching and learning strategy, we have a philosophical principles of social constructivism within the faculty, and so that policy consideration was already sort of implied to us. And then we've talked at length about nursing and midwifery council standards for education. So I'm rushing through that bit a little bit, but anyway.
Can I say something quickly, Rachel?
Yeah.
I've been asked by Nadine to say that the seminar this afternoon has been cancelled, just so everyone knows. I think she's going to email us all as well about it, but there's no seminar at 2 o'clock.
Oh, right, okay.
Thank you.
So, any questions before I finish?
No, I thought that if you put back on again the seminar. Oh dear.
Okay, yeah. So what I'd say...
Margaret's happy to do it at home.
Sorry?
So I think it's back on again the seminar this afternoon. It says here, I'm happy to go ahead with the webinar. I'm based at home. Bear with me, it's my first attempt.
Oh, right, okay.
So that seems to have
sorry,
changed last minute.
I see that now. Thank you.
Oh, it's like rock and roll.
Okay, so in terms of curriculum design, that's a bit of an overview, lots of discussion. There's loads of resources that Nadine has put up online for you to read. I've put a little discussion document up there, which we talked about when we were starting the principles. There's an interesting article from Nurse Education Today. Lots of reading to do. Any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And it's been lovely to chat. And I will see you all in March. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks.
All right then. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.